Simon Bridges was born in October 1976. All the mathematicians are quickly trying to figure out how old you'll be in October. In Auckland, the youngest of 6 children. His father was a part Maori Baptist minister, and his mother a New Zealand European from Waihi. I think we have some people from Waihi, don't we? Thank you.
Married in Waihi Baptist.
Oh, I know the pastor there. And Mum was a primary teacher. Simon grew up in Te Atatu, West Auckland, and attended Rutherford College, and he was taught there by future Labour Education Minister Chris Carter. Simon Bridges became head boy of the college. Went on to complete a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and History and a Bachelor of Law with honours at the University of Auckland. He has served as the leader of the New Zealand National Party and leader of the opposition, the largest party in Parliament, but still the leader of the opposition, go figure, since 27th of February 2018. He's been the Member of Parliament for Tauranga since the 2008 election, and he has served in several cabinet portfolios, including Minister of Transport, Minister of Economic Development, and Leader of the House. Now, Simon met his wife, Natalie, a British-born public relations consultant, while she was studying at the University of Oxford. And the couple have 2 sons, 6 and 4, and a daughter born last year. And we have a photo of them at the... No, there's a nice family photo. And then we've got another photo of them at the top of Mount Maunganui. And that was actually while Parliament was sitting. So they're still keeping fit, which is good to see, because I ran into Simon a couple of years ago running down Mount Maunganui Beach during the January holidays.
Didn't one of us have our shirt off? I'm trying to think.
Yes. You looked okay. So, Simon, if we can get into it, and perhaps just a general broad question to start with. As a family person with children, what do you believe is the greatest concern of families at the moment?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, I think it's just a very complex, confused world with, a whole lot of things being thrown at children from all over the place. And so, a need for children, I think, of our kids to come back to a very stable, loving environment where they're getting the values that the parents want to give them.
Okay, let's, in our limited time, let's look at some specifics, because there seems to be a lot of social issues going on and a lot of what people would say is social engineering. So I'd like to touch on some of these hot topics. And just to reassure you, we have provided the questions in advance to Simon, simply because we don't want surprises. We want him to, have the chance to give considered responses. We don't want to get the gotcha moment. So the first one we had on our list was euthanasia. You voted against David Seymour's bill in the first reading. Thank you. Will you continue to do so?
Hey, well, thank you. Look, I'll continue to vote against it. I mean, my arguments are really pretty simple, and be very clear. And I think if I look at the good folk from National down here, they all voted against it as well.
That's why we invited them.
Yeah, right. But it's a conscience issue for members of Parliament National. I certainly wouldn't be directing in any way our MPs how to vote. We're a broad church, as they say, and we have all manner of views. But for me, I take a very simple view on the bill and the issue of euthanasia. I acknowledge it's got its complexities. Technology and science is keeping people alive much longer, and that does make it more of an issue than perhaps it was in the past. But I believe life is sacred. I believe there's a sanctity to life that makes me uncomfortable with the issue generally. But more than that, I think it's a thin edge of the wedge argument. I'm quite influenced by work, for example, I've seen from the Maximus Institute that shows what's happened around the world where it's been, and what starts quite a narrowly confined issue does tend to, their work shows grow, so that younger people, those with depression, these sort of issues are caught in the ambit. And so that's very influential for me as well.
So the polls suggest that 70 to 80% of New Zealanders support euthanasia, and yet in the recent inquiry and in the select committee submissions, well, I think it was 78% opposed in the inquiry. Our understanding is that it's close to 85, even higher, opposed in the select committee process. So why do you think the difference? Why is it the public polls suggest support, but all the submissions are saying, no, don't go there?
I think because, it's part of the zeitgeist of the times. I think the reality is that people, when asked a question like, what do you think about euthanasia, want to be compassionate. And, we know in the very sad stories about some of the high-profile cases that have been in the media, the pain and so on. I've met these people as well as a local member of parliament. They are harrowing. And as I say, there's the complexity there about those issues. I think what is also true, though, in terms of that select committee, is those people who have thought very deeply about it are very motivated on it, and they tend to be against it. I personally believe, as people think through the issues involved with it, more and more people, as they do that, to the extent that they do, would be against it. But it's a question of, people doing that and thinking it through.
So, when you have examples, and they are heartbreaking stories of families that are facing, for example, Huntington's disease, horrific diseases, how do you respond to those situations that sometimes people think, hey, look, there is some justification there, but yeah, I'm still uneasy. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think you just got to acknowledge, what they're going through and the reality of that. I think, as I say, it's just very complex, and the truth is as well, and again, I don't profess to be an expert, but in our hospitals today, there are situations, of course, where the medical specialists do intervene, and that's probably right in those circumstances. I can think of a constituent who came and saw me. She had a debilitating illness and so on. She wanted the right to end her life. She felt strongly enough to come and see me about it and talk all of that through. The reality for her, though, was several years later, when she thought she only had several months left, she's still alive. All of that said, she still believes strongly, as I understand it, in her position for, voluntary euthanasia. But, I think just that example shows you the complexity and again, gives me some reason for, my opposition to the bill.
So one thing that we've been calling for is full public health resourcing of palliative care. And, for example, hospices, and I know the Honourable Maggie Barry has a private member's bill to bring that about. But then again, I could say, well, for 9 years, National never fully funded hospices, never brought about this palliative care. Because that really is a solution, isn't it? We can rail against euthanasia, but we need to put up a solution to those hard cases.
I think that's right. Look, I think if you look at us, and I don't mean to be overly defensive, actually we continued to increase the funding for hospices. I personally believe it's the right thing not to fully fund hospices. I think they are better. They run better, they're more effective, they have more of a heart in their communities, if they also have a very, if you like, community private base to them. Now, that's not easy. They have to go out there and raise money and do that. And the government also needs to make sure it's continuing its funding. But I personally, I totally agree with what you say. They're an incredibly important part of the answer against euthanasia if you want, and you'd want to have them even if we did see euthanasia in New Zealand. But I also think we wouldn't want to lose that private community base that they have.
Okay, let's move on to abortion, another tough topic. Firstly, do you support abortion being in the Crimes Act?
I think on that directly, and maybe we can come back to that in a bit more detail, I believe we need to see what the Law Commission says about that. I think when you think about abortion and what's going on here, again, I would say very much New Zealanders will be quite influenced by what they saw in Ireland and the situation there. I would make the comment, though, that what happened in Ireland is very different in really every way to the New Zealand situation, where, of course, in Ireland, it was completely unlawful. Really, a young woman in a very difficult situation, let's say a rape, for example, would have had to go offshore there. They'd smuggle in those abortion pills, those sort of things. Well, that hasn't been the position in New Zealand, obviously, for a very long time. We have had lawful abortions for a very long time. I'm very pleased that the rate of those abortions has come down quite significantly. And I know you would say, Bob, nowhere near enough, and I understand that. But I think the context for Ireland and New Zealand are very different indeed, and that informs me in how I approach this.
Okay, you have been a Crown prosecutor, so you'll understand the role and the purpose of the law. So I'd like to ask you the question again. Yep. Do you support abortion being in the Crimes Act?
You know, you've
Is it a
heard me
crime
on
to take a life?
You probably heard me on Radio New Zealand on this, or I've got a hard time on the issue. The reality is I do just want, because I don't actually understand it particularly well in all its permutations, see what the Law Commission comes through with, what the government then proposed on that. Let me give you this, though. I believe it will be relatively unlikely that the Law Commission will come back and simply say, take it out of any kind of criminal statutes. I mean, I think the truth is, for abortion, there will always be a criminal component to that. As I say, I think it's unlikely that they would recommend it being completely seen as a health issue. I think the reality is, it is both.
Okay, could I ask a supplementary question then?
Unlike Parliament, you don't run out, my friend.
And Trevor's not judging this. Should it remain?
And I'm not going to give them to you and then take them away like he does.
If abortion is the taking of a human life, should it remain in the Crimes Act?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think the reality is we need to see what the Law Commission says.
But you personally,
I personally think the reality is it will remain with a criminal component, albeit there's a health component.
And why do you think it should have a criminal component?
Well, because I think, look, you just go back through the history of abortion, and the reality is it's a situation where, you know, we know the stories about the home operations and so on and so forth. There will always have to be some sort of criminal treatment to that, it seems to me. But look, I'm not hedging my bets. I just think we should see what the Law Commission says. I think we should see what the government proposes. The most important thing to me about all of this, I've said it before, I'll say it again though, it should be rare, it should be safe, it should be legal. It's pleasing that it's coming down. What I wouldn't want to see, whether it's Crimes Act, health legislation or whatever, I don't believe we need to see in New Zealand, or we should see in New Zealand, a more permissive regime that could or would lead to more abortions. I think what's really good in New Zealand is that rate has come down. We've had actually quite some success with teen pregnancies and the like through education, through wraparound services, and that to me should be a real focus as well.
So do you think the unborn child should have a right to life?
Yeah, I mean, look, in general, yeah. But, you know, I also think, Bob, we live in a very complex world where there's many complex situations, and there is a balancing here between the rights of women in certain circumstances and the rights of those unborn children. I certainly, though, you know, be really clear, don't want to see a more permissive regime than we have today.
There is concern that, in effect, the government hasn't asked the Law Commission to actually examine the effectiveness of the law or actually do a thorough investigation into the harms of abortion. They've basically been told what the outcome should be. Are you concerned about that?
Look, I think until we see what they say, it's a bit hard to kind of prejudge, well, they're going to go in this direction, it's a fait accompli, the government said to them, you know, what it is they really want to see the outcome as, and so on and so forth. I'm prepared, in fact, I think the right approach is to reserve judgment, to get that, to read it, to see what the government's response. I go back, though, to something you said earlier, Bob, and you said, you know, concern about social engineering and the like. I think the reality of this current government is, if I can be somewhat political about it, but I am a politician, surprise, surprise, it is a situation where there are social reforms out there, because I think this government sees them as easy, right? And in the absence of a real program for New Zealand, they're things they can put out. I think what we're discussing and what we would, I hope, agree on is they're anything but easy. They're complex, they've got real permutations, they have flow-on effects to the family, to society, communities and society. And but I make the point, I believe that's why we've got this going on, because in the absence of you know, other hard structural reforms for New Zealand, it gives the sense of an agenda when I believe there really isn't one.
So some of the solutions, some of the changes that some people would like to see in the law is more fully informed consent to make sure that women aren't being coerced to have abortions, independent counselling, a time period to consider, more information about medical risks and psychological risks of abortion. Do you support those types of measures?
I think all of that sounds very sensible. Certainly you wouldn't want to see coercion in this situation. You would want to ensure that people were thinking it through.
What about parental notification? Because when it went through select committee 2 years ago, national MPs joined with the other MPs in voting against parental notification. What do you think about parental notification?
I mean, be really clear, as a parent, I'd want to know. Yeah. I would want to know.
And so does Jacinda Ardern want to know as well when the Labour youth camp issue came up.
Yeah, I would want to know what's going on. I think all of that said, the issue is this. I'd want to know. I want to ensure that in dealing with this, say at a school level, there's real encouragement to the young person, the young girl, to tell their parents. I think what that report you're referred to as well, though, is when you talk about effectively making that mandatory, there are circumstances where actually that young girl would be in real jeopardy were she to tell the family. And you can, think of those sort of dysfunctional family situations where that would be the case. And so that does make me stop short of a mandatory setting in that. Albeit I think, whilst not, at any level suggesting I'm an expert on this and what happens in schools, I think rather than a very laissez-faire approach, there should be encouragement for the young woman to be advising her parents. As I say, in my situation, as I'm sure in yours and those in this room, I'd want to know.
Let's move on to drugs. Decriminalisation. Let's just break down the marijuana issue, because that's obviously coming up, and it could be that we have a national referendum on it, maybe next year, maybe the following year. So let's just break it into two. Firstly, medicinal marijuana. You opposed the Greens bill in 2009, and you also opposed the Greens bill at the end of last year. Yep. There's now another bill that's been put in by the government, which seems to be, in my view, more moderate, a little bit more reasonable. Where do you stand on the medicinal marijuana?
Yeah, I mean, I think in principle, medicinal marijuana, I can go along with. And the reason I say that is, look, if you think about our medical system, the health system, the reality is this. Morphine is a Class A drug in the Crimes Act. But if you are in care, in fact, I think my 6-year-old son, when he went under general anaesthetic, had some literally earlier this week, you will receive it, right? And it has a legitimate, in fact, more than legitimate, an essential medical purpose. And so I can see cannabis in that light. Actually, for legitimate, truly medical pain relief, I go along and support that. Now, you mentioned the Green Bill. The reality is the Green Bill was a Chloe Swasbrook bill in Parliament. It wasn't medicinal cannabis. It was decriminalisation, right? Through the back door. You're allowed to grow it in your backyard as much as you want, give it to your mates, and you could drive a bus through that in terms of it being not really medicinal, actually decriminalisation. I couldn't go along with that, and I can flesh out the reasons why and I'm sure we'll come to it, don't support actual decriminalisation. There is, you're right, a bill before Parliament at the moment. And National and our caucus is considering our position on it. Let me, without kind of jumping to the conclusion, because I think we want to think that through, but let me say this. If it's real medicinal cannabis bill with appropriate criteria around that, relatively stringent criteria around that, we'll support it. If it's not, if what it really is through the back door is de facto decriminalisation, or certainly I wouldn't support it. Actually, for National MPs, the issue of decriminalisation, just like abortion, just like euthanasia, would be a conscience issue. My hunch, although I'm not speaking for other MPs, is more would be against than for a de facto decriminalisation bill.
Okay, so let's move on to decriminalisation. I mean, you've sort of said it's a conscience issue, but interestingly enough, you voted as a party against the medicinal marijuana one, Chloe Shorwick's. So for recreational marijuana, will the National Party take a position and oppose it?
I think the complexity of the, I'll just get myself right here, but the complexity of this is medicinal actually we would see as a health issue where we tend to vote on party lines. Decriminalisation, that is a conscience issue. The issue, though, is, what that bill was saying it was doing was medicinal, but it wasn't really. We voted against it because it didn't achieve its purposes and it wasn't the right thing. Look, on decriminalisation, my position is pretty simple. I'm not ultimately particularly moralistic about this. I don't necessarily see drugs as not entirely at least, a moral issue. It's a question of harm. But I've got to tell you, I think you alluded to it in your opening remarks, as a former Crown prosecutor who's done dozens of drugs cases. Yesterday I was in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. I'd done dozens around that area. I've seen the harm. It debilitates communities. It has a clear link to mental illness and the like. And so on that basis, personally, I've got to say I would find it very hard to support a decriminalisation of drugs. Now, people will argue with you, and they'll say, in fact, I was with someone yesterday, say, in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. She hates drugs. Her son now has mental illness as a result, psychosis really, I think was what she said, as a result of cannabis over the years. But she is adamant that what needs to happen is decriminalisation so we can deal with the harm. I can see that argument, but as I say, I'm certainly not there on it.
So, groups like the Drug Foundation want us to follow Portugal and decriminalise all drugs, including methamphetamine. So the argument for...
And they also want us sort of teaching people how to use meth in schools and the like. So,
yes. People are starting to wake up
pretty
to them.
cynical about some of their views.
Okay, so the argument is, look, it's not a criminal issue, it's a health issue, which we've heard in other issues as well. But our argument is that it's both, that you need the weight of the law to sometimes force people to get a health response. Would that be correct from your experience?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. and I also think, look, it's like all these things, nothing's simple. Yep, okay. Marijuana is illegal today, but nevertheless, it's very readily available, and there are a lot of people using it. I'm told on good authority, I've just talked about the Eastern Bay, but of course it's all around New Zealand and schools. People can get hold of it. It's a real issue there. I do worry, though, I think it's what you're saying, that you decriminalise and you legitimise. And suddenly it's not only those who are using it right now, but as other children say, well, it's legal. And, we've got this funny situation, haven't we, where I personally agree with it. I was on a tobacco inquiry in Parliament in my early, I think, first 3 or 4 years of Parliament. It really changed my views on tobacco. And we went pretty hard on that to get to smoke-free. And we're not there, but actually we've made a lot of progress. We've taxed the heck out of it. We've gone plain packaging. We've put them behind the cabinet. We've done a variety of things in that area. So we're doing that on the one hand, and then we're sort of going to go the other way on drugs, illicit drugs. And again, I just think the messaging we send to our young people could be very confused.
Let's talk about the issue of marriage, because in 2013 you voted against same-sex marriage. You voted against having a referendum on the matter, and you were absent for the conscientious exemption bills, the protection for celebrants, etc. Right. You might have been up Mount Maunganui.
I'm just not sure about what you're saying about that being during house time. That might have been when we posted it. But, you can't prove when that photo was taken.
We superimposed.
See, I'm still a criminal lawyer at heart. Where's your evidence?
In your first interview with Television New Zealand, you said this, and I want to quote.
Yeah.
Regrets, probably if I think about it, I've had a few. I know people will say these social issues you're conservative on, but I don't think I necessarily regret the decisions I made by assessing the evidence at the time.
Yeah.
Take gay marriage. Now, I understand the depth of feeling around those issues. Would I change it, the current law? No, I wouldn't. Would I go back and change my vote? Yes, I probably would. What happened? Is it a prerequisite for a national leader to change their view on gay marriage?
No, I think, look, it's pretty simple. New Zealand's moved on. and I've moved on. And, all jokes aside, you just look there and you say, what harm has that caused? Now, my arguments at the time were reasonably clear. If you were gay and you loved your partner, civil unions were there. They provided all of the legal entitlements, if you want to put that, safeguards that marriage legally provides. Marriage, my argument was, is a religious institution that goes back, thousands of years. And so that was the distinction I drew. The reality is this, Bob, as you well know, the vast majority of Parliament, or the majority of Parliament voted for it. New Zealanders are in favour of it. As I say, I think New Zealand's moved on, and I have as well. I can't see that there is any harm. In fact, you'd argue there's, been good that comes from it. Do you define marriage as one man, one woman? No, I don't think I can today, in New Zealand, because that's not the situation we're faced with. I think marriage is, two people who come together and they fulfil the legal requirements for marriage. I mean, that may sound a bit legalistic, but I think that's the reality of it. I think there is still, though, a religious institution of marriage that probably is, as you say, man and woman, but that's not the position in New Zealand on the law, actually factually today. Would you support a bill to extend it further, to allow polygamy, group marriage, to allow for immigrant groups coming into New Zealand? No, look, my experience is one wife is more than enough. No. My response to that is, why? It's not a threat to your marriage. Move on. Yeah, no, look, I understand everything you're saying, but no. I mean, it's no. But why can you oppose polygamy and group marriage, but you... Look, I think because ultimately, Bob, and all these things we talked about, you can be black and white. I don't see black and white, actually. I'm a Christian, but I know that there are shades of grey in life. There is complexity, whether it's euthanasia, whether it's abortion, whether it's marriage. And to try and suggest otherwise, I think, doesn't accord with life and the diversity of life and what we see, happening in modern day New Zealand. But polygamy, as I say, that's way too tiring. But it is becoming more normalised because of the types of immigrant groups we're having in New Zealand. There will be a push for it, won't there? And I wouldn't support it. That would suggest you're bigoted. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Bob. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I just wonder why MPs who voted against same-sex marriage can't stand up and say, yes, I voted against same-sex marriage, I still would. Parliament chose to reject the cultural and the natural purpose and role of marriage. Equality is not advanced by destroying institutions. Why won't national leaders say that? Because ultimately New Zealand evolves and moves on, and it really is. We live in a country which is a liberal democracy, where people get to vote, where there's a separation between state and church and these various things. And I had my vote at the time. I think New Zealand's moved on. But you don't stand by that vote. I guess that's the bit that concerns a little bit, that you don't stand by that vote. Because ultimately, I'm leader of the National Party. I'm leader of a party that represents nearly half of New Zealanders, and it is my duty at a level to stand up for some things I believe in, and I do. Okay. But also reflect where modern New Zealand's at, and I think New Zealand's moved on that issue. Look, put it this way. I've just come, I was telling you before, I've been in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. Yesterday I did public meetings, probably 1,000 people in Rotorua, in Kawerau, in, I don't want to miss out any of the towns. Where else was I? Whakatane. Several places, right? People raised euthanasia. People raised abortion. No one raises same-sex marriage. I've now done 40-some meetings. This is not a live issue that most New Zealanders are concerned about, that they are thinking about. And I think that's important for me to be thinking about in terms of, as I say, what New Zealanders are worried about and where they think the country should be heading.
So just before we leave this one, just in terms of religious freedom, is religious freedom important to you? Because, you know, we've exposed the fact that 50 independent marriage celebrants have been refused their celebrancy because they believe in traditional marriage. They won't marry same-sex couples. And current independent celebrants, and remember, independent celebrants do 2/3 of all marriages in New Zealand, that they will be sacked if they don't do same-sex marriages.
And I disagree with that.
Right.
You know, I think the reality is you're absolutely right. You mentioned the word bigoted before. We need to be really careful about that. You know, we have free speech in this country. People should be able to have all manner of views that are, you know, if you want to put it this way, outrageous on every side of the political, the moral spectrum. And I think you're right to be worried about that, to guard against that. You know, we cannot have a society where we try and shut down these debates. And so I'm with you on that issue of conscientious objection. By the way, you know, as you know well, that was clearly the position going into the bill that people said would be guarded, and that's important. But I would say this: it is a two-way street. You know, just as they're allowed, you know, people are allowed views on their very, if you want to put it this way, conservative side spectrum, so are people allowed those views on the other, and that's the sort of society we need to have, because, you know, hundreds of years ago we separated church and state for these sort of reasons.
So does the declining marriage rate concern you? Do you think a government should be doing more to promote marriage in society? Does marriage have a role to play in society?
No, I don't think the government should. You know, I just don't. You know, if you think about what drives me, it's my children. It's a sense of, you know, what will the future be like for them. But, you know, I don't want the government telling me what to do in my family, right, for the most part. You know, I think it's my obligation and my responsibility as a father, as a parent who loves his children, to be providing them with values and so on. I don't want a preachy nanny state doing that to me. Because to your point, look, one day that might be conservative Christian. The next day it might be very different. And I think we need to be mature about that and make sure that the state has a role in relation to, you know, the economy, the allocation of resources, the incentives it provides. But you know, we have freedoms within reason as to how we do things. I'd also say in this audience, let's be really clear. Politicians have some responsibility in these big debates that we have, but they're very much issues for communities and societies and NGOs. And I'd argue, actually, with that separation of church and state and society and state, there is much, if not more, on those groups as they are on actual governments and political parties to be making the case, you know, and what we're talking about right now for marriage, for the sort of things that we're talking about.
10 years on, the anti-smacking law, the opposition still remains very high. Now, the benchmark that John Key always said was, if I see good parents being criminalised, then I will fix the law. Public lawyer May Chen says, yes, good parents have been criminalised and what the politicians promised hasn't been delivered. So what is your benchmark for reviewing the law?
I can't see the law being reviewed. I think, you know, the reality is, I come back to that sort of test I put for you. Are New Zealanders raising with this me? If I thought good parents with light correction were being criminalised in a significant way. Well,
May Chen says they are, and there's plenty of examples.
Well, again, you know, let me tell you really clearly, I keep my ear pretty close to the ground. I met with, as I say, probably 1,000 people yesterday. Over the course of my public meetings, I've met with many thousands of people. They raise all manner of issues, the good, the bad, the ugly, the crazy. No one has raised this, Bob. They just haven't raised it. You know, I think the reality is you've got a workable law there, and I'll give you a reason why I'm very much inclined not to consider changing the law. I already said I'm a jury trial lawyer. I've been pretty forthright with you on my views on drugs on the back of that, and they are, if you want to put them in quotes, conservative. Actually, on this issue, you know, I've also done the cases. I can remember one of a man who beat his son with a vacuum cleaner pipe repeatedly. He got off on the back of the law you would have us go back to.
But David Bain got off as well. We're talking about we're talking about the smacking issue, though.
I think the reality is, actually, on the law today, you have seen less of that serious violence to children. You say that, but actually, I would argue that, and it is a workable law that we're not seeing criminalising good parents.
One of the key topics that we're doing today is gender identity. And I mean, with 3 young children who will be exposed to some of these ideas, I guess we're just keen to find out where you sit on it. The message is that what's your sex is determined by what's between your legs, but your gender is determined by what's between your ears. Do you want your children to be told that they can choose their gender?
No, I don't want to see schools kind of getting into instruction on this or any of those things. And it comes back to everything we've really talked about, the legitimate role of the state in these things, and, the role of families and values to have choice and to, provide their values in these areas. So, I wouldn't want to see, wholesale instruction on these sort of issues. I just don't think that is necessary.
So if schools are already doing it, you'd be concerned?
Well, look, I want to see what they're saying and have a sort of sense of that.
So have you seen the Inside Out program that's been run by Family Planning in schools?
No, I haven't.
Rainbow Youth programs?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Do you think that toilets should be based on biological sex or gender identity in school toilets?
Ultimately, that's for these schools to sort of work out. I mean, if it's well, okay, all right. If it's relax, it's all right. We'll all be fine.
But your kids are going to be exposed to this. I mean, as we say,
and my school has boys and girls toilets.
No, but one day, for example, a child may have gender identity disorder and demand the use. I mean, we know of a South Island school, a girls' school, that enrolled a biological boy and massive furor over which toilets to use. So it is a clear and current issue. I know it may not have been talked about in Kawerau Wakatani yesterday, but this is a big issue for families about what their children are being taught.
Yeah, and look, I get that. I would come back to it. I mean, I think the reality of navigating life, and these sort of issues is just a bit more complex than that. I think, there's sex, there's gender. For the most part, for most people, those are the same things. But it's just a little bit more complex than that. I think schools on the ground have the maturity, the judgment, they have boards of trustees that people can get on and have views on these things. But ultimately, if in the odd school around the place there's a unisex toilet to deal with these issues, I'm not going to come here and tell this audience something different than I tell other. I don't see what the harm in that is.
No, and I don't think anybody does with a unisex toilet where there's that ability to protect the major population of the school. Yep. But what about when the activists demand that your daughter has to accept a biological boy using your daughter's changing room and sleeping in your the camp cabin of your daughter? Does that concern you?
I think the appropriate solution to that is the one we've just discussed.
But that's not what the Human Rights Commission thinks, or the PPTA, or a number of organisations going into schools.
Well, look, I don't know everything about that, but as I say, I think the reality is, for schools to decide for there to be unisex toilets in some occasions is not something that would concern me.
Just while we're talking about schools, do you think there's a place for Bible in schools? I mean, would you defend the right of Bible in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's very similar to what we've just been discussing, actually, which is, mature schools, teachers, principals, boards of trustees deciding these things. This is something that they should be deciding, not the courts, not the Human Rights Commission and the like. Because I think, this is a really important point we've just discussed, because we've gone from the issue of gender and sex to Bible in schools. Well, let's be a bit principled. Let's actually have the same rules for one as the other, and defend the right of people actually to have different views, to have freedom of speech on these issues. Now, that's the case in relation to sex and gender, but I tell you what, it should also be the case in relation to Bible in schools.
And I think that's why it's optional, isn't it? There is the opt-out, and that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there is a call for it to be taken out completely.
Yeah, and I disagree with that fundamentally.
There's also a call for to acknowledge the harms of pornography, that it's much greater because of the nature of it, the violence of it, the connection to sexual violence.
Yeah.
And so there was a petition which we led, which has called for an expert panel to examine it. The Select Committee are currently considering it. The Select Committee includes a number of national MPs. Where do you stand personally on should there be an expert panel to examine the societal harms of pornography?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's good you've got that petition forward. You know, that's before, the Governance and the Admin Select Committee. And I wish you well with all of that. I mean, I don't think, as a father, I could argue anything else. And, we'd be a bit worried about these sort of issues, pornography and what it means and the harms that might be there. My understanding is that you've already got a situation, whereas at ACC and Ministry of Health, I think, are looking at some of things. That's right. We do want to make sure we're evidence-based, we're research-based on these sort of issues. I would sort of simply say to you, though, a word of caution. It comes back to all of the things we've been talking about in a way. I'm not sure that, and it's not necessarily exactly what you're suggesting, but the regulation will provide you some sort of answer necessary to these things. One, I think it'd be easy to get through, and that's been, to some extent, as I understand it, the experience overseas. But I also think, for me, as a father, I have a parental responsibility in these issues, to making sure actually I'm doing the sort of things that are safe around the internet at home, that I'm providing guidance about what the values are I want in these areas. I think it also raises a really live issue more broadly than just pornography around online and the harms of that, in terms of online bullying and, all of these things that, again, I wouldn't just put it on government. These are things for individuals, for families, for communities, for society to be thinking about, pretty deeply.
Okay, we're just about there. Just two quick questions. Firstly, just in terms, there's a big discussion around imprisonment at the moment, and law and order. Should we build more jails? Bill English said jails are a moral and fiscal failure, but then Judith Collins said, well, no, what Bill really meant was that they're a fiscal failure because we've got to pay as taxpayers for what other people have done, and they're a moral failure because prisoners have failed morally. Which side do you come down on?
Well, look.
They're both right.
They're a moral failure, but we haven't got to heaven just yet, my friend. The reality is, I can't envisage a society, sadly, where we won't have a recourse for prisons, because there are some people out there who repeatedly commit incredibly serious violence, sexual offending, Class A commercial drug offending. So we need prisons. Now, would any politician, Bill English, Judith Collins, Simon Bridges included, me included, would we rather be building early childhood centres and all of these other things than prisons? Yeah, we would, but call me old-fashioned when this government, maybe for some nice reasons, don't want to build those additional prison beds. They want to slash the prison population by a third, and they're going to do that without any plan to reduce offending and reoffending. They're simply going to soften up the bail, the sentencing, the parole laws. That makes us less safe. Doesn't work. And it's, with respect to them, a pretty naive, stupid sort of a way about going about things.
And so, I was interested to ask you this because being a Crown prosecutor, you've seen, obviously, things that we haven't. Do you think that prisons are still important? Are we sending too many, I guess the question is, are we sending at the moment too many people to prison?
Yeah.
And is it achieving the outcome that actually we all want, which is, one, safety for us, but also rehabilitation for the offender?
Look, isn't the answer that, of course, you've got to do all the things that, look, Bill English, who you mentioned, devoted his last few years to, social investment, as he called it, getting in individual, family, whānau by whānau, and really try and do everything you can to, where the risk factors are there, preventing them from going to jail. Is it a drug and alcohol course? Is it getting mum into work? Is it, some sort of Cool Bananas values program? Is it all of those things? That's fantastic. You got to do that, right? Keep more out of a prison. By the way, I don't see any of that from this government. Yeah, and then at the other end, when they're in prison, By the way, you need decent fit-for-purpose prison builds to do this sort of work, though. Rehabilitating them, reintegrating them, work programs, so that when they get out, because they'll all get out, they are much less likely, and we can look at the evidence and work out what those programs are, to re-offend. But none of that is an argument for not building the prison, because sadly, the average criminal in our prisons today has 46 previous convictions. They didn't get there for smoking a joint down the main road of Hamilton or Wakatani.
Okay, just finally, probably the most important question I need to ask you today is, should Family First New Zealand remain a charity?
So many of these questions, I know the answer the audience wants.
The interesting thing is that I noted in April 2014, Greenpeace launched a campaign calling for Simon Bridges to be sacked. So charitable organisations may not be your favourite groups. Family First has been told that promoting the traditional family is not a public benefit, and therefore we do not deserve charitable status, and it's currently before the court. Do you think charities should have the ability to be able to talk about policy, top-of-the-cliff stuff, political decisions, dumb decisions and good decisions?
Look, personally, I wish you all the very best as a politician. I think the law is the law. I think ultimately it's going to be a legal question for 2,000-fold better than me, but the charities registration board or commission to look through. But I certainly wish you all the very best.
But do you think there's a role, do you have a problem with charities like Greenpeace, like Child Poverty Action Group, Family First, speaking up and challenging political decisions?
No, but I suppose ultimately it goes to the primary purposes of whether it's Family First or Greenpeace, and I probably have a bit of a different view on each one personally, as I say. Greenpeace they don't send me fan mail, I hate to tell you. But I think ultimately you've got to have it, as long as your law is right, as long as the board is applying that faithfully and dutifully and not being quite political, then I think that's probably the right place for that decision to be made. I wish you all the very best with it.
Just finally, one day Simon Bridges will do a valedictory speech in Parliament. I'm sure you hope that's not sooner. You hope it's later.
Well,
than
you've
sooner.
already been pretty bold in telling me what dates of photos. So do you want to give me a prediction on that one?
Well, I would just like to ask you, what would you like the headline to be in terms of the legacy of Simon Bridges?
Look, I think if we sum up that and everything you've talked about today, I'd like to be remembered as a compassionate, thoughtful Conservative.
Thank you. Would you thank the Honourable Simon Bridges?
Thanks very much. Good to see you.